They were given mere scraps, pig feet, corn husks, and wild weeds. Yet, from practically nothing, enslaved people constructed a vibrant food culture that continues to nourish America today. These weren't simply meals, they were a means of survival. Every plate held pain, resilience, and a narrative that most history books overlook. In this segment, we are revealing 25 survival foods of slaves on plantations. These forgotten dishes sustained people through one of history's darkest periods and represent the hidden origins of foods still served at our tables. Pay close attention, as some of these will certainly surprise you. Parched corn. When severe hunger struck in the fields, a cooking pot or fire was often unavailable for a meal. This is where parched corn came in. Enslaved individuals would toast dried corn kernels until they were browned and had a burst of flavor. It was easily carried, satisfying, and could last for weeks without going bad. Consider it their original trail mix. Except, it wasn't for leisure trips, it was essential for survival. Parched corn provided enough energy to push through back-breaking labor. Occasionally, it was the only food a person had for an entire day. Today, you can see its legacy in kettle corn at fairs or the roasted corn nuts sold in service stations. However, for those living on plantations, this was not a casual snack. It was a matter of life or death. And here is the profound impact. This basic survival food did not just keep people alive. It became the very foundation of Southern food traditions that we still enjoy today. But what happened when the corn ran out? The answer was another dish so unadorned, so basic, it even astonished visiting outsiders: boiled cornmeal mush. If parched corn was the portable survival food, then cornmeal mush was the warm meal that kept people going at night. It was simply cornmeal, water, and salt, boiled until it thickened into a heavy porridge. There was no milk, no butter, none of the additions we use today, just enough to soothe an empty stomach. This dish was so commonplace it appeared repeatedly in slave narratives. Sometimes it was served in wooden troughs where children would gather with spoons, eating side by side like young animals at a pen. It was harsh and humiliating, but it sustained their lives. Here's the notable detail. Mush was not only dinner. Cold leftovers were sliced and fried the next day, transforming into something resembling polenta cakes. That simple resourcefulness, boiling once, frying twice, doubled the food supply and saved any scraps that might have been wasted. Today, you can still see its trace in Southern fried cornmeal cakes or even Italian polenta fries on restaurant menus. Yet, for the enslaved, mush was survival in its purest form, plain, dense, and unforgettable. Turnip greens stew. When meat scraps were scarce, which was almost always the case, enslaved families looked to the earth itself. Turnip greens, those bitter leaves most people would discard, became the core of survival stews. They were boiled soft, seasoned with nothing more than a sprinkle of salt, or perhaps a sliver of pork fat if one was fortunate. This was not about comfort, it was about endurance. But here is the essence. Greens provided more than just calories. They provided strength. They filled the stomach with warmth when winter winds penetrated thin clothing and bare cabins. A pot of turnip greens simmering over a fire was not just food. It was hope extended into a meal. Over time, that bitter, earthy taste became familiar, even treasured. Families passed down methods to temper the bitterness: slow cooking, mixing in roots, and adding whatever scraps were available. That tradition strongly resonates today. Enter a Southern kitchen, and you will still find pots of greens on the stove, collards, mustards, or turnips, seasoned and served with cornbread. However, for the enslaved, it began with survival, not flavor. A stew crafted from leaves, stalks, and scraps most people wouldn't touch. Cowpea stew. Long before black-eyed peas became a New Year's tradition, They were a survival food on plantations. Enslaved Africans brought their knowledge of cowpeas with them across the ocean. These were resilient beans that thrived in the southern heat and poor soil. They were inexpensive, filling, and rich in protein. They were a vital source of sustenance when meat was only a memory. Cowpea stew was simple. Boil the beans until soft, add a little salt, perhaps throw in a scrap of pork rind if available. Occasionally it simmered with wild herbs or onions foraged from the fields, but most often it was just beans and water. Plain, heavy, and nourishing. But here is the powerful meaning. Cowpeas were not just about survival, they were a flavor of home. For many enslaved people, this was one of the few foods that connected them back to Africa, where cowpeas had been cooked in stews and porridges for generations. Eating them wasn't just filling the belly, it was clinging to a piece of their identity in a world intent on erasing it. And today, that heritage is alive every time black-eyed peas are served with rice or simmered into Hoppin' John. What began as a survival stew is now a symbol of good fortune, prosperity, and Southern tradition. Dandelion greens, boiled soft. When we think of dandelions today, we typically picture garden weeds, something to remove or spray. But for enslaved families, those so-called weeds were a gift from the land. Dandelion greens grew freely, required no planting, and filled pots when nothing else remained. Boiled until soft, the greens lost some of their bitterness, though not all. Sometimes they were seasoned with a dash of vinegar, or maybe a sliver of fat. But most days it was just greens and water, a thin broth, a chewy morsel, and just enough to take the edge off hunger. Here is the hidden benefit. Dandelions contain nutrients, iron, vitamins, and strength. Even if plantation owners were unaware or indifferent, enslaved cooks understood that these weeds were more than just filler. They were survival medicine, and this survival food never vanished. In parts of the South, dandelion greens were eaten well into the 20th century, and today they have returned as a fashionable superfood in upscale restaurants and health stores. Imagine that. What was once a food of desperation now sells for several dollars a bunch. Molasses water, sweet ration drink. Sugar was a commodity on the plantations, and enslaved people rarely tasted it. However, occasionally they would be given a small allowance of molasses, thick, dark, and sticky. It wasn't exactly candy, but it was sweet, and that sweetness was profoundly meaningful. The easiest way to make it last was to stir a spoonful into a tin cup of water. That was molasses water, an impoverished person's energy drink. It provided quick calories and a rush of sweetness in a life where flavor was almost always bitter. For children, that cup was a rare indulgence. For adults, it was fuel, enough to push through another day in the fields. Sometimes it also served as medicine, mixed with herbs to alleviate coughs or soothe the stomach. It is striking how much this resonates today. Molasses water was for survival, but it was also the origin of Southern desserts, barbecue sauces, and baked goods we appreciate today. That sticky sweetness defined the flavor profile of an entire region, but if molasses was a rare luxury, the next food was the total opposite, scraps so undesirable that plantation owners discarded them. And yet, enslaved cooks transformed them into a meal that still sparks discussion today. Salt pork scraps, fried or boiled. Meat was a rarity that enslaved people almost never encountered, unless it was the cuts no one else wanted. That's where salt pork scraps entered the picture. Plantation owners kept the hams, chops, and roasts, while the fat trimmings, rind, and remaining pieces went to the slave quarters. Fried in a pan, those scraps released grease that seasoned everything from beans to greens. Boiled, they became chewy bites in a pot of stew. And when there was no actual meat left, enslaved cooks meticulously saved every drop of fat, stretching it to flavor cornmeal mush or bitter greens. Here is the plain truth. Salt pork was never intended as a gift. It was inexpensive, preserved, and considered unsuitable for refined tables. But in the hands of enslaved people, it became a fundamental element of survival cooking. That salty, smoky flavor permeated entire meals, making scraps taste like a feast. And the legacy persists today. Southern soul food, from collard greens simmered with ham hock to fried cabbage with bacon, can be traced back to those discarded pieces. What was once thrown away has become a source of comfort. Pumpkin and wild greens pottage. When food supplies were dwindling, enslaved cooks had to be inventive with whatever the land provided. Pumpkins growing wild in patches and bitter greens from the fields often ended up together in a single pot. The outcome was a pottage, a simple stew that was more about survival than celebration. Chunks of pumpkin offered sweetness and substance, while the greens, tough, bitter, and stringy, filled out the pot. Sometimes the entire dish simmered with just water and salt. Other times, if fortune smiled, a thin slice of pork fat or a stray onion enhanced the flavor. Nothing was wasted, nothing was extravagant, but together it created enough to share. This wasn't merely food, it was survival ingenuity. It meant taking the bland, the bitter, and the unwanted and transforming them into something warm and satisfying. That kind of cooking fostered resourcefulness and endurance. And the effect is still felt. You see it today in southern pumpkin soups, fall stews, and even the way greens are cooked down slowly until they soften into comfort. What started as an impoverished pottage has become a cornerstone of seasonal cooking: roasted pumpkin seeds. After the pumpkin flesh was used in the pot, nothing was discarded, not even the seeds. Enslaved families would wash, dry, and roast them over hot coals with a little salt if they had it. The seeds became a rare, crunchy treat. They weren't just delicious. Pumpkin seeds were packed with protein and fat, things that were scarce in a diet based mostly on grains and greens. Especially for children, a handful of roasted seeds could mean the difference between going to bed hungry and sleeping with at least a small sense of comfort. Here is what makes it significant. This was survival food born from what others considered waste. What most plantation kitchens scraped out and threw away, enslaved cooks converted into something useful, even enjoyable. That instinct to save, to maximize, to create something from nothing was the definition of survival. And it is a tradition that endured. Today, roasted pumpkin seeds appear in snack bags at gas stations, sprinkled over salads, and even marketed as superfoods in health stores. What was once food of desperation now sells for a price. Turnip root roast. When bread was a luxury and meat was a mere fantasy, the modest turnip root became the next best thing. Dug straight from the soil, thoroughly cleaned, and roasted in the ashes of a fire, it transitioned from tough and bitter to something soft, earthy, and subtly sweet. Enslaved families regarded roasted turnips as filler food, something to appease hunger when cornmeal was gone. Sometimes it was eaten plain, sometimes mashed, and sometimes sliced thinly and fried in pork fat if scraps were available. It was a poor man's potato, a survival man's bread. But here is the remarkable point. Roasting brought out a richness that made it almost feel like a special treat. Imagine the aroma of a smoky fire, the root blackened on the exterior, steaming on the interior. It wasn't just food, it was warmth, something you could hold in your hands on a cold night. And this practice persisted. Roasted root vegetables became an established part of southern kitchens, church gatherings, and even holiday dinners. What began as survival cooking carved a permanent place in American food traditions. Okra and corn mash. Okra was not native to America. It traveled over on slave ships, carried in memory and in seeds concealed in cloth. On the plantations, it grew well in the southern heat, and enslaved cooks combined it with the one crop they always possessed: corn. The result was okra and corn mash, a dish that was simple, filling, and directly linked to Africa. The mash typically consisted of thin-sliced okra pods boiled down with ground corn or grits until it became a thick, sticky stew. It was sometimes slimy, sometimes gritty, but consistently enough to fill a stomach. When pork scraps or onion were available, they would be tossed in for flavor. But most nights, it was just the two fundamental ingredients, corn and okra. Here is the deeper narrative. Every mouthful of this dish was survival, yes, but it was also cultural memory. Okra stews and corn porridges were already part of African diets long before slavery. So when enslaved families combined them in America, they weren't just eating, they were preserving a part of who they were. And you can still witness it today. Gumbo, succotash, and southern okra dishes all trace their origin back to that mash. What began as survival in the slave quarters became flavor woven into the South's identity. Foraged persimmons, mashed or eaten raw. Sweetness was infrequent on the plantation table, which made persimmons feel like a treasure. Growing wild in southern woods and fields, these small orange fruits looked harmless enough. But take a bite before it was ripe, and your mouth would pucker from the bitter astringency. However, wait until the frost hit, and that same fruit turned soft, sweet, and golden. Enslaved families understood the secret. They foraged persimmons late in the season, eating them raw or mashing them into pulp. Sometimes the mash was dried into thin cakes, carried as a portable food for long days in the fields. Other times, it was mixed with water to create a kind of sweet drink, like nature's substitute for molasses. Persimmons were not just about flavor. They represented luck, timing, and knowledge of the land. Knowing when to pick them, how to prepare them, and how to make them last made the difference between a bitter error and a rare moment of sweetness in an otherwise harsh existence. And persimmons never disappeared. You can still find them in southern backyards, transformed into puddings, breads, and even country wine. What was once a foraged survival fruit became a hidden gem of southern cooking. Broken rice porridge, Carolina middlings. On the Carolina plantations, rice was paramount, but enslaved families rarely saw the fine, polished grains that enriched the planters. What they received instead were the middlings, broken pieces of rice left after milling. To the owners, it was waste. To the enslaved, it was survival. Those fragments were boiled into a thin porridge, sometimes salted, sometimes mixed with scraps of beans or greens, but most of the time, it was just rice and water. It wasn't elegant, and it didn't keep you full for long, but it provided fuel for another day of work. Here is the compelling factor. Enslaved Africans already possessed profound knowledge of rice cultivation and cooking from their homelands. They knew how to extract flavor and nourishment even from the broken grains, and in doing so, they preserved not only their bodies, but their culture. That broken rice porridge was a lifeline. Over time, the concept of extending humble rice into soups, porridges, and stews became a foundation of southern kitchens. Even today, dishes like rice gruel or congee-style porridges echo that same survival method. Wild muscadine grapes. Deep in the southern woods, tangled vines offered a secret bounty, muscadine grapes. They were thick-skinned and bursting with juice. These wild grapes were not the neat, seedless variety seen in stores today. They were messy, tart, and sometimes sweet enough to feel like a miracle. For enslaved families, muscadines were a rare taste of plenty. Children foraged for them, staining their hands and mouths purple, while adults mashed them into pulp or boiled them down for juice. If enough were collected, the fruit could even be preserved into syrups, a way to extend the sweetness into the lean months. Here is the deeper significance. Muscadines were not just food, they were a taste of freedom. They grew outside the plantation's control, in woods and thickets, available for the taking if you knew where to look. Finding them was a small act of self-reliance, a reminder that the land still offered gifts, even in the harshest times, and muscadines never left southern life. Today, they are made into jellies, wines, and juices, valued as a native fruit. What once kept hunger at bay is now bottled and sold on store shelves. Boiled cow tongue. On the plantation, the premium cuts of beef never reached the slave quarters. But when a cow was slaughtered, parts like the tongue, tough, fatty, and deemed undesirable, sometimes did. Enslaved cooks let nothing go to waste, and boiled cow tongue became both a necessity and an example of resourcefulness. The preparation was straightforward. The tongue was cleaned, boiled for many hours until tender, and then sliced thinly. Sometimes a dash of salt or a splash of vinegar added flavor, but most of the time it was eaten just as it was, chewy, substantial, and filling. Here is the truth. Tongue was more than just a scrap. It was a rare source of genuine protein and fat in a diet that heavily favored grains and greens. For families accustomed to stretching vegetables and corn into meals, having actual meat, even from the tongue, felt like a small triumph. And what is fascinating is how that discarded part transformed over time. Today, beef tongue is a delicacy in cuisines all over the world, from tacos de lengua in Mexico to deli-style tongue sandwiches in New York. What the enslaved once ate out of necessity is now served on menus for a high price. Cracked corn grits, plain. If there was one food that never vanished from the slave diet, it was corn. Ground finely, it became mush. Left in larger pieces, it became grits. Enslaved families boiled cracked corn in water until it swelled and softened into a thick, plain porridge. No butter, no cream, no cheese, just corn and water. This dish was filling, but it was not an indulgence. It was survival fuel, heavy enough to quiet the stomach, simple enough to make in one pot, and cheap enough to always be available. Day after day, grits appeared at the table in some form, morning or night. Here is the part that resonates. Even though it was plain, grits became a fundamental element of Southern cooking. Over time, with seasoning, milk, or gravy, they evolved from survival food into comfort food. But in the slave quarters, plain grits were often the first bite of the day and sometimes the only one. It is a powerful reminder of how staples endure. Today, grits are dressed up with shrimp in fine dining establishments or smothered with cheese at diners. But their true origin is much harsher. A bowl of cracked corn, keeping bodies alive under impossible circumstances. Sassafras root tea. When plain water became monotonous, enslaved families looked to the woods for flavor. The root of the sassafras tree, dug from the earth and boiled, made a tea unlike any other. It was earthy, aromatic, with a hint of sweetness. Long before root beer was ever bottled, sassafras root tea was a survival drink. It wasn't solely about taste. Sassafras was believed to possess healing properties. A hot cup of the tea soothed coughs, eased fevers, and provided comfort when no real medicine was accessible. For people compelled to work from dawn till dusk with little rest, that was crucial. Here is the striking aspect. Enslaved cooks were not just boiling roots out of desperation. They carried herbal knowledge from Africa and acquired new understanding from Native Americans, merging traditions to survive. Sassafras became more than a drink. It was resilience in a cup. And this survival tea left a lasting impression. Centuries later, its flavor inspired root beer, a drink now enjoyed globally. But its beginning was not sweet soda and frosty mugs. It was enslaved families huddled by firelight, sipping warmth from a root extracted from the ground. Pickled cucumbers and peppers, brine preserve. Fresh food never lasted long in the slave quarters, so preservation became a crucial method to extend the harvest. Using just salt, water, and thyme, enslaved cooks transformed cucumbers and peppers into sharp, tangy pickles that could last for weeks. The method was simple: slice the vegetables, pack them into jars or crocks, and pour brine over them. After a few days, the crunch lessened, but the flavor became intense, sour, salty, sometimes even spicy if peppers were included. For families eating plain corn mush or bitter greens, a pickle on the side was a burst of flavor that made survival meals more palatable. However, pickling was not only about taste, it was about security. When gardens and fields ceased producing, those jars of preserved vegetables meant there was still something to rely on. A sour bite in the depth of winter could be the difference between another day of strength and the edge of starvation. And the legacy continues. Southern kitchens never abandoned it. Chow chow, pepper relish, and bread and butter pickles all trace back to those first brined jars on the plantation. What began as necessity became tradition. Foraged black walnuts. If you have ever cracked a black walnut, you know it is a difficult task. The shells are thick, the stain saturates your hands, and the nut meat is hidden deep inside. But for enslaved families, black walnuts were worth every strike of a rock or hammer. Gathered from the forest floor, the nuts were prized for their richness. Once cracked, the kernels offered protein, fat, and a flavor much stronger than regular walnuts. Sometimes they were eaten raw. Other times they were chopped and mixed into porridges or used to stretch a simple dessert when molasses was available. Here is the deeper truth. Black walnuts were not just food, they were survival treasure. Every nut cracked meant energy stored, a small win against hunger. Families would save them for lean months or carry them into the fields for quick nourishment. And over time, their legacy spread. Black walnut cake, black walnut ice cream, and even old-fashioned candies all originate from a food-enslaved people first foraged out of necessity. What the land presented as a difficulty, they turned into sustenance. Stewed cabbage cores. On the plantation, the crisp outer leaves of cabbage might make it to the owner's table, but the tough woody cores were discarded. In the slave quarters, however, cabbage cores were not considered waste. They were boiled down, softened, and transformed into a survival stew. The cores were chopped and simmered for hours until the fibers broke down. Sometimes they were flavored with a pinch of salt, or if they were lucky, a scrap of pork fat. More often, it was just cabbage and water, thin, bland, but enough to put something warm in an empty stomach. Here is the powerful lesson. Enslaved families could not afford to waste anything. What others threw away, they found a way to consume. Those cabbage cores filled the pot and stretched meals a little further. And in a world where every calorie counted, even the scraps mattered, and this resourcefulness left a lasting impression. Southern kitchens to this day have recipes that use the entire vegetable, including stewed cabbage, braised stalks, and even pickled stems. What began as cooking born of desperation became part of the region's food identity. Green tomato chow chow relish. When the harvest concluded and tomatoes were left hanging green on the vine, enslaved cooks refused to let them go to waste. They chopped those unripe tomatoes, mixed them with peppers, onions, vinegar, and salt, then simmered it all into a sharp relish called chow chow. It was bright, tangy, and slightly spicy, the kind of flavor that could cut through the heaviness of beans, corn mush, or boiled greens. A spoonful on the side turned plain survival food into something that actually stimulated the taste buds. And in a life where meals were typically bitter or bland, that mattered more than most people realized. But here is the broader context. Chow chow was not just about flavor, it was about preservation. By pickling and spicing what could not ripen, enslaved families stretched food into the cold months when gardens were bare. It was a survival strategy concealed in a relish jar, and its legacy still shines today. Southern tables, from barbecue joints to Sunday dinners, served chow chow alongside meats, beans, and cornbread. What started as a way to save scraps has become a Southern tradition with deep roots in the slave quarters. Chicory coffee, roasted chicory brew. Coffee was a luxury reserved for the main house, but in the slave quarters, enslaved families found their own replacement. They dug up the roots of the chicory plant, roasted them until dark, and ground them into a coarse powder. When brewed with hot water, it created a bitter, smoky drink that looked and felt like coffee, even if it wasn't. For many, chicory brew was not just about taste, it was about ritual. Having something warm to sip at dawn, before heading to the fields or late at night when the body ached. It offered comfort, a small measure of dignity, and sometimes even tricked the mind into thinking it was the genuine article. Here is the twist. Chicory did not disappear when slavery ended. In New Orleans particularly, it became a cherished tradition. Even today, famous cafes blend chicory with coffee, serving a drink that traces back to the ingenuity of enslaved people making do with what they had. So, while the masters drank imported beans, the enslaved sipped roasted roots. Both cups were hot, and both carried meaning, but only one was born of survival. Scrap bone broth. When the meat was completely gone, when even the fat and scraps had been picked clean, there was still one thing remaining: the bones. Plantation kitchens discarded them, but in the slave quarters, nothing was wasted. Enslaved families gathered those thrown-out bones, put them in a pot of water, and simmered them for hours. The result was scrap bone broth, thin, oily, but rich with whatever nutrients the marrow could release. It was not a hearty stew. Most of the time there was no meat left on the bone, but slowly boiling them extracted flavor, strength, and just enough fat to extend plain corn mush or greens. For children and the sick, that broth could be the difference between weakness and another day's labor. Here is the hidden truth. Bone broth today is sold as a health trend, bottled, branded, and expensive. But its true origins trace back to survival cooking in slave quarters, where it was never about wellness trends. It was about staying alive with bones stripped bare. Roasted green corn in husk. In late summer, when the corn was still tender and green on the stalk, enslaved families would secretly enter the fields and pull a few ears. The simplest way to eat it was to toss the entire ear, husk and all, onto hot coals. After a short time, the husk blackened, the kernels steamed, and roasted green corn was ready. The flavor was smoky, sweet, and filling. It was a rare indulgence that required no pot, no seasoning, and no scraps of meat, just fire and patience. Children particularly enjoyed it, nibbling down to the cob, savoring every bite. For adults, it was quick energy after exhausting days, a way to taste the harvest before the fields were entirely picked clean for the plantation. Here is the striking observation. Roasted corn was not just survival, it was a moment of happiness. One of the few times when food felt like a gift instead of a mere ration. Gathered around the fire, husks in hand, enslaved families found a small taste of freedom in the most basic of foods, and that tradition persisted. Today, roasted corn appears at fairs, festivals, and backyard cookouts across America. What once signified endurance now represents celebration. Wild onion and garlic soup, thin broth. Out in the fields and woods, enslaved families foraged not just for greens and fruit, but also for the sharp flavor of wild onions and garlic. These hardy plants grew along ditches and forest edges. When boiled in water, they made a thin, pungent soup. It was not substantial. Most of the time it was just broth, clear, light, and flavored only by those wild bulbs. But in a life of constant hunger, even that thin soup carried significance. The sulfur-rich plants helped fight off sickness, cleared the chest, and gave a feeling of warmth when stomachs were otherwise empty. Children might sip it like medicine, while adults drank it to sustain themselves through long nights. And when scraps of salt pork or fat were added, if any could be spared, the soup turned into something closer to an actual meal. Here is the legacy. Today, onions and garlic form the basis of almost every cuisine worldwide. But for the enslaved, their wild cousins were not just flavor, they were survival, a bitter broth that carried bodies through the hardest of days, and with that, we have come full circle. From roasted corn to bitter greens, from scrap bones to wild herbs, every dish tells the same story. Survival carved out of struggle and a food culture that still resonates in Southern kitchens.